One of the biggest mistakes people make when dealing with an avoidant is believing that more effort will create more connection. It seems logical on the surface. If someone is pulling away, you move closer. If they become distant, you send another message. If they seem uncertain, you try harder to prove your value. But psychology doesn't always follow logic. And when it comes to avoidant behavior, this strategy often produces the exact opposite result. The more you chase an avoidant for validation, the less motivated they become to invest. Not because they are cruel, not because they don't care, but because human beings naturally value what they must actively engage with, not what is constantly placed in front of them. When someone always has access to your attention, your reassurance, your emotional energy, they stop feeling the need to reach for it. Think about what chasing actually communicates beneath the surface. Most people believe they are expressing love. They believe they are demonstrating commitment. Yet what often gets communicated is something entirely different. Chasing says, "My emotional state depends on your response." It says, "I need something from you in order to feel secure." And the moment another person becomes responsible for your emotional stability, the dynamic shifts. Avoidants are particularly sensitive to this shift. They are highly aware of emotional expectations, even when those expectations are never spoken aloud. The more pressure they feel to provide reassurance, certainty, or constant emotional availability, the more their instinct is to create distance. That what started as attraction begins to feel like responsibility. What started as connection begins to feel like obligation. This is why so many people become trapped in a painful cycle. The avoidant pulls away. The other person feels anxious and increases their efforts. The increased effort creates more pressure. The avoidant feels overwhelmed and withdraws even further. Then the anxious partner tries even harder, believing persistence will eventually break through the wall. But the wall gets stronger. What breaks the cycle is understanding a simple truth. Validation is not something you should be collecting from another person. It is something you must generate within yourself. The strongest individuals are not those who never experience rejection or uncertainty. The strongest individuals are those who refuse to let another person's behavior determine their worth. When you stop looking to someone else to confirm your value, something remarkable happens. Your energy changes. Your presence changes. Your decisions change. You stop sending messages just to get a response. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop trying to convince someone to see what should already be obvious. Instead, you begin operating from a place of self-respect. And self-respect is attractive because it communicates abundance rather than scarcity. Most people think attraction is created by convincing someone. In reality, attraction is often strengthened when you stop trying to convince anyone of anything. Confidence is not demanding recognition. Confidence is knowing who you are, whether recognition arrives or not. This is where many avoidants become confused. They become accustomed to being pursued. They expect the texts. They expect the check-ins. They expect the emotional pursuit. Then suddenly the person who was constantly seeking validation is no longer doing it. They are focused on their own life. They are emotionally grounded. They are no longer asking for permission to feel valuable. That shift creates something powerful. It creates space. And space allows awareness. For the first time, the avoidant has the opportunity to feel your absence instead of your pressure. They have the opportunity to wonder instead of react. They have the opportunity to move toward you because they want to, not because they feel obligated to. The paradox is that the moment you stop chasing validation is often the moment people begin to recognize your value. Not because you manipulated them, not because you played games, but because you finally stopped giving away the one thing that should never depend on another. Person's approval, your sense of self-worth. And when you no longer need someone to validate your value, you become impossible to ignore. Now, once you stop chasing validation, the next challenge appears, and for most people, this is where the real test begins. You see, it's one thing to stop sending the extra text. It's another thing entirely to stay emotionally grounded when an avoidant becomes distant. Most people don't react to distance itself. They react to what they think the distance means. The avoidant takes longer to respond, and suddenly the mind creates a story. Maybe they're losing interest. Maybe they're talking to someone else. Maybe the relationship is ending. Within minutes, imagination turns uncertainty into certainty. And once that emotional spiral begins, People often start making decisions from fear rather than reality. They send emotional messages. They demand answers. They look for reassurance. They try to force clarity. The problem is that emotional reactivity rarely creates connection. More often, it creates resistance. An avoidant is highly sensitive to emotional pressure. When they sense intense emotional demands, their instinct is not usually to move closer. Their instinct is to create more space. What feels like an attempt to solve the problem from your perspective may feel like overwhelming pressure from theirs. This doesn't mean you suppress your emotions. It doesn't mean you pretend not to care. Emotional maturity is not the absence of feeling. Emotional maturity is the ability to experience strong emotions without allowing those two emotions to control your behavior. That's a critical distinction. Anyone can remain calm when everything is going well. The true measure of emotional strength is how you respond when things become uncertain. Philosophers have discussed this idea for centuries. The Stoics understood that suffering often comes not from events themselves, but from the meanings we attach to them. Two people can experience the same situation and respond completely differently because they interpret it differently. The same principle applies here. An avoidant creating distance is a behavior. The story you create about that behavior is something entirely separate. When you learn to separate facts from assumptions, you regain your power. Instead of reacting impulsively, you become curious. Instead of chasing certainty, you tolerate uncertainty. Instead of trying to control another person's actions, you focus on controlling your own responses. And that shift changes everything. Because emotional stability creates a kind of strength that people can feel. When an avoidant expects panic but encounters calmness, something unexpected happens. The familiar pattern is interrupted. They expect emotional pursuit. They expect frustration. They expect pressure. Instead, they encounter someone who remains centered. Someone who respects themselves enough not to beg for attention. Someone who trusts their own value regardless of another person's temporary behavior. That energy is rare. Most people become emotionally reactive because they believe urgency will create results. But urgency often communicates fear. Calmness communicates confidence, and confidence is magnetic. The truth is that every relationship will contain moments of uncertainty. Every connection will face periods where answers are unavailable and emotions are uncomfortable. The people who navigate those moments successfully are not the ones who react the fastest. They are the ones who remain grounded the longest. Because when you stop reacting emotionally to every shift in someone else's behavior, you stop giving away control of your inner world. And the person who controls their emotions controls their future. Master your reactions, and you master the relationship you have with yourself. And that is where real power begins. Once you've stopped chasing validation and learned to stay emotionally grounded in the face of distance, another transformation becomes possible, one that may be the most important of all. You stop making them the center of your life. Now, this is a mistake people rarely recognize while they're in the middle of it. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual shift. At first, you simply care about someone. Then you start thinking about them more often. You begin organizing your schedule around them. Their mood influences your mood. Their attention determines your confidence. Their approval affects how you feel about yourself. Without realizing it, your life starts revolving around a single person. And the problem isn't love. The problem is dependence. When your emotional well-being becomes tied to another person's behavior, you surrender a tremendous amount of power. You begin living reactively instead of intentionally. Your focus narrows. Your priorities shrink. Your sense of identity slowly becomes connected to whether this one individual is moving toward you or away from you. This is especially common when dealing with avoidance because uncertainty has a strange effect on the human mind. We tend to become obsessed with what feels unavailable. The less certainty we have, the more attention we give it. The less access we have, the more important it appears. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement. It's the same mechanism that keeps people pulling the lever on a slot machine. The unpredictability itself becomes addictive. You never know when the next reward is coming, so your attention becomes locked onto the possibility of receiving it. And many people unknowingly turn relationships into emotional slot machines. They're constantly waiting for the next message, the next sign of affection, the next indication that everything is okay. Meanwhile, the rest of their life begins fading into the background. Their goals become secondary. Their passions become neglected. Their friendships receive less attention. Their personal growth slows down. All because one person has become the primary focus of their emotional energy. But here's what confident, emotionally healthy people understand. A relationship should enhance your life, not become your life. The strongest connections are formed between two whole individuals, not between one person and someone they have turned into their entire world. When you redirect your energy toward your own growth, something profound happens. You begin reconnecting with the parts of yourself that existed before this relationship. You invest in your health. You pursue meaningful goals. You strengthen friendships. You develop skills. You create experiences. You build a life that feels fulfilling whether someone texts you today or not. And paradoxically, this is often when attraction increases. Why? Because people are naturally drawn to those who possess purpose. Purpose creates energy. Purpose creates confidence. Purpose creates momentum. When someone sees that your happiness is not dependent on their presence, they begin seeing you differently. You're no longer waiting on the sidelines of your own life, hoping they choose you. You're actively creating a life worth living, and that's powerful. An avoidant may not immediately notice your words. They may not immediately respond to your efforts, but they notice changes in energy. They notice when someone stops orbiting around them and starts moving towards something meaningful. The goal was never to make them your world. The goal was to invite them into a world that was already rich, meaningful, and complete. The moment you stop making one person the center of your life is often the moment you become the most valuable person in theirs. Once you stop making another person the center of your life, something naturally begins to change. You become less dependent on their attention, less consumed by their behavior, and more connected to your own purpose. And that leads directly into the next mistake that keeps so many people stuck with avoidance. They make themselves constantly available. At first glance, this seems like a positive thing. After all, aren't relationships supposed to be about being there for one another? Isn't availability a sign of commitment, care, and emotional investment? Yes, but only when it exists in balance. The problem begins when availability turns into accessibility without limits. When someone can reach you at any moment, receive your attention whenever they choose, and access your emotional energy without making any effort, something important disappears. Appreciation begins to decline. This isn't because people are selfish. It's because human psychology is heavily influenced by contrast and perception. We value what feels meaningful. We value what requires intention. We value what cannot simply be assumed. Think about almost anything in life that people deeply appreciate. Time, trust, respect, opportunity. None of these things are valuable because they are unlimited. Their value comes partly from the fact that they must be earned, protected, and treated with care. Relationships are no different. When you become permanently available, you unintentionally communicate that your time has little value. You train others to believe that your attention will always be there, regardless of how they behave. And over time, what was once appreciated becomes expected. This is particularly important when dealing with avoidant personalities. Avoidants often become comfortable when they know someone will always remain available, no matter how much distance they create. The relationship begins operating without any natural tension, curiosity, or uncertainty. There's no reason for them to wonder, no reason for them to reach, no reason for them to invest more deeply, because everything is already being provided. Now, let's be clear. This is not about playing games. It's not about deliberately ignoring someone or pretending to be busy in order to manipulate them. Those tactics rarely create healthy relationships. What we're talking about is something entirely different. We're talking about developing genuine boundaries. A boundary is not punishment. A boundary is simply an expression of self-respect. It is the recognition that your time, energy, attention, and emotional resources have value. When you have strong boundaries, you stop rearranging your entire life every time someone decides they want your attention. You stop treating every message as an emergency. You stop believing that immediate responses are required to maintain connection. You stop sacrificing your priorities in order to remain constantly accessible. Instead, you begin living according to your own values and commitments. And something fascinating happens. You become more attractive, not because you're less available, but because you're more engaged with your own life. People can feel the difference. There's a certain energy that comes from someone who has places to go, goals to pursue, and responsibilities that matter to them. Their attention becomes valuable because it is intentional, not automatic. And intention creates meaning. This is where many avoidants begin to experience something they haven't felt before. Curiosity. Not because you've disappeared, not because you've become cold, but because you've stopped making yourself endlessly accessible. For the first time, they have room to wonder what you're doing. For the first time, they notice that your life continues moving forward whether they're present or absent. For the first time, they encounter someone who values their own time as much as they value the relationship. And that realization can be incredibly powerful, because attraction is not sustained by constant access. It is sustained by respect. Respect for each other's individuality. Respect for each other's priorities. Respect for each other's boundaries. The healthiest relationships are not built between two people who abandon themselves for one another. They are built between two people who maintain their own identities while choosing to connect. That choice matters, because what is freely chosen will always be stronger than what is constantly available. When you stop giving unlimited access to your time and energy, you remind both yourself and others of something essential. Your life has value beyond the relationship, and the moment people recognize that value, they begin treating it differently. Your attention becomes powerful when it is a choice, not a guarantee. Once you've stopped chasing validation, stopped reacting emotionally to distance, stopped making them the center of your life, and stopped being constantly available, a deeper shift begins to take place. You're no longer focused on getting someone to choose you. You're focused on becoming someone worth choosing. And that distinction changes everything. Most people approach relationships from a position of pursuit. Their attention is directed outward. They're constantly analyzing another person's behavior, trying to predict what they think, what they feel, and what they might do next. They spend so much energy studying the other person that they neglect the one person they did actually have control over, themselves. But real power begins the moment your focus returns inward, because the truth is, you cannot force an avoidant to appreciate you. You cannot force them to miss you. You cannot force them to recognize your value. What you can do is become the kind of person whose absence is impossible to ignore. And that starts by building a life they can feel themselves losing. Now notice the wording carefully. Not a life designed to make them jealous. Not a life created to prove a point. Not a performance meant to manipulate someone's emotions. A genuinely meaningful life. There's a profound difference. Many people attempt to create the appearance of growth. They post more. They try to look happier. They want someone else to see that they're doing well. But appearances rarely create lasting change. Real transformation happens when your growth is no longer about the other person at all. It's about you. It's about becoming stronger, wiser, healthier, and more fulfilled regardless of who stays or leaves. Psychologically, this matters because human beings are drawn toward people who possess momentum. Think about it. When you encounter someone who is passionate about their goals, committed to personal growth, engaged with life, and constantly evolving, there's an energy around them that's difficult to ignore. Why? Because growth signals possibility. Growth signals confidence. Growth signals self-respect. And perhaps most importantly, growth signals that this person does not need external validation to keep moving forward. That's incredibly attractive. Many avoidants become accustomed to relationships where the other person remains emotionally stationary, waiting for them to make a decision, send a message, or provide reassurance. But when they encounter someone who continues growing without them, something shifts. For the first time, they are forced to confront a possibility they may have been avoiding. Loss. Not imagined loss, real loss. Because every day you spend investing in yourself increases your value, not just in the eyes of others, but in your own eyes. You become more capable, more confident, more emotionally resilient, more interesting, more connected to your purpose. And as this happens, your relationship with yourself begins to strengthen. That's the part people often overlook. The goal isn't simply to make an avoidant notice your growth. The goal is to become so engaged with your own evolution that their recognition becomes a secondary. Because once you reach that point, something extraordinary happens. You stop operating from fear. You stop fearing abandonment because your life no longer depends on one person's presence. You stop fearing rejection because your self-worth is no longer attached to someone else's goals' approval. You stop fearing uncertainty because you trust your ability to create a meaningful future regardless of the outcome. And that inner stability changes how others perceive you. People can sense when someone is moving forward with purpose. They can sense when someone's confidence comes from achievement rather than attention. They can sense when someone's happiness is rooted in growth rather than dependency. This is why personal development is so powerful. Not because it guarantees someone will come back. Not because it guarantees an avoidant will chase you. But because it ensures that your life continues expanding no matter what another person chooses to do. And ironically, that's often when people begin to see your value most clearly. Because while you've been focused on building a meaningful life, they've been watching someone become increasingly difficult to replace. The greatest leverage you will ever have is becoming so committed to your own growth that losing you becomes a consequence others cannot ignore. And after everything we've discussed, we arrive at what may be the hardest lesson for most people to accept. Do nothing. Not forever. Not out of bitterness. Not as a strategy to punish someone. But long enough to allow something powerful to happen. Long enough to let silence and time do the work that force never could. This is where many people sabotage all the progress they've made. They stop chasing for a few days, but then anxiety returns. They stop reacting emotionally, but then they start looking for signs. They focus on themselves for a short period, but eventually they feel tempted to reach out one more time, explain one more thing, send one more message, or create one more opportunity for connection. What they don't realize is that every time they interrupt the process, they also interrupt the possibility of awareness, because awareness requires space. Human beings rarely understand the value of something when they are constantly surrounded by it. We become aware through contrast. We recognize significance through absence. We understand meaning when we are given the opportunity to feel what life is like without something we once took for granted. This principle applies to relationships just as much as it applies to anything else. When someone is constantly present, constantly available, constantly explaining themselves, constantly trying to maintain the connection, there is very little room for reflection. There is activity, there is communication, there is noise, but there is very little reflection. Silence changes that. Silence removes distractions. Silence creates perspective. Silence forces people to confront their own thoughts rather than continuously reacting to someone else's efforts. For avoidance, this can be especially significant. One of the defining characteristics of avoidant behavior is the tendency to suppress, postpone, or distance oneself from uncomfortable emotions. As long as there is movement, distraction, or emotional pressure coming from the other person, it becomes easier to avoid deeper reflection. But when the pressure disappears, something interesting often happens. The mind begins filling the empty space. Questions emerge. Thoughts return. Memories resurface. Experiences are reevaluated. And emotions that were previously pushed aside finally have an opportunity to be processed. Now, it's important to understand something here. Time does not magically make someone love you. Time does not guarantee reconciliation. Time is not a tool for controlling another person's decisions. What time does provide is clarity. Clarity for them, and equally important, clarity for you. Because while many people spend their energy hoping an avoidant will realize what they lost, they overlook a much more important possibility. What if time helps you realize what you deserve? What if the silence that allows them to reflect also allows you to reflect? What if the distance helps you recognize your own strength, your own resilience, and your own capacity to create a meaningful life independent of anyone else's choices? That is where true transformation occurs. Not when someone comes back, not when someone finally sends the message you've been waiting for, but when your emotional stability no longer depends on whether that message arrives at all. Because at that point, you've reclaimed your power. You've stopped trying to manage another person's journey and started taking responsibility for your own. You've stopped chasing outcomes and started building character. You've stopped measuring your worth by someone else's behavior and started measuring it by your own standards. And from that position, something remarkable happens. If the avoidant reaches out, you respond from strength rather than need. If they don't, you continue moving forward from strength rather than disappointment. Either way, you win, because your future is no longer being held hostage by someone else's uncertainty. That's the real purpose of silence. That's the real gift of time. Not to make another person choose you, but to help you become someone who chooses themselves. When you stop forcing what should happen and allow time to reveal the truth, you gain something far more valuable than another person's attention. You gain your freedom. As we bring this conversation to a close, remember that none of these principles are about manipulating an avoidant into chasing you. They're about transforming the way you show up in your own life. Stop chasing validation. Stop reacting emotionally to every shift in their behavior. Stop making them the center of your world. Stop being endlessly available. Build a life filled with purpose, growth, and self-respect. Then have the patience to let silence and time reveal what words and effort never could. Because the truth is, the moment you stop trying to force someone to see your value is often the moment your value becomes impossible to ignore. If an avoidant comes back, let it be because they genuinely recognize what they almost lost, not because you convinced them, pressured them, or sacrificed yourself to keep them close. And if they don't come back, you'll discover something even more important. You have become stronger, wiser, more confident, and more fulfilled than before. That's the real victory. The goal was never to make someone chase you. The goal was to become so grounded in your own worth that whether they chase you or not, no longer determines your happiness. Because the most powerful person in any relationship is not the one who holds on the tightest. It's the one who knows their value, honors their boundaries, and continues moving forward with purpose, regardless of who decides to come along for the journey. Remember this: when you stop chasing approval and start building an extraordinary life, you don't attract people through force. You attract them through the undeniable power of who you life. You